Welcome, everybody, to the LSA, to the LSA's Thursday lunchtime talk series. Really good to be back. It feels like a little while since our last one, but here we are, with an amazingly packed lineup, a fantastic lineup, and a packed schedule. My name is Samantha Hardingham. I am the academic director at the LSA, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming Nick Delo, from director at Stiff Trevillion, Simon Howard. You have an amazing title, Director of Standards at the ARB, Architects Registration Board, and Chloe Mawette, who is the first, am I right in saying, the first architecture intern?
Yes, that's right.
Very good. As part of the Build the Way scheme, which we will hear more about very soon. Build the Way, run by GPAD. So all assembled under the title Alternative Routes into Architecture. I guess what I will remind everybody, as if you need reminding, that the LSA was set up and established really on the back of an article that Will Hunter, founder of the school, Will Hunter, wrote back in 2012, called Alternative Routes for Architecture, ARFA for short. And really what came out of that article and what Will posed was really a critique of current architectural education, and that it's too expensive, too monocultural, too not nearly diverse enough, and not representing both the culture and the landscape and the world that we are in right now. And how can that start to change? Well, the change came with Will establishing the school with that very clear ambition and vision set. So it's really, I guess, wholly appropriate that we should start to explore that, also particularly in light of the ARB's recent shot across the bow of all schools of architecture to say it's time to start thinking differently, and how can we do that? So without further ado, what we're going to do is we will have three presentations, I think, of about 10 minutes each. And then we'll, I think, probably leave questions and discussion to following those three presentations. So I am going to hand over to, and I'm just checking my schedule to make sure that I get the order correct. In the correct order. Yes, Simon. Simon, you're going to go first. Is that right?
Yep.
So over to you, Simon. I'm going to let you kick off.
Thanks very much, Sam. And hello, everyone. Just while I share my screen, by way of introductions, I do have the rather grandiose title of Director of Standards, which means educational standards and professional standards. At the Architects Registration Board, for those of you who don't know, the ARB is the statutory regulator, which is a very exciting title, of all architects in the UK. There's about 43,000 architects in the UK, and we've got a number of duties. And the one that's most relevant for us to talk about today is we control access to the register. We control who comes on and who goes off the register, and we set the standards for educational attainment that need to be attained in order to access the register. And over the past 3 years, we've been carrying out a piece of work to review the current arrangements and what we can do to possibly improve them. Over that 3 years, which has been involved a huge amount of research and engagement across the sector and beyond, we've reached a number of conclusions. Starting, of course, that the structure of initial education and training, or IET as I'll call it from here on in, needs to change. There are clearly issues with it that need to be addressing. Secondly, that rather than focusing on what a student must learn, an outcomes-based approach would facilitate higher professional standards within the profession. So that means focusing what an architect is capable of doing, what skills they have, what behaviours they demonstrate, what experience they have, as opposed to just listing things that they've learned, as we currently do. And also, and this is really interesting, we did a really deep analysis on what competencies architects will need, not just now, but in the future for the rest of the 21st century. And we did that by analysing, by talking to the profession and talking to employers and clients, but also looking at how architects are educated around the world. And the conclusion we've come to is the existing criteria, the existing things that architects need to know are by and large not too bad. They do need to change, but not by too much. This is certainly evolution rather than revolution. That's to say, the competence of architects coming onto the register through the current system is good, but it can still be improved. So the next slide sets out the current framework of how architects are currently educated and trained. And you can see, for those of you who are part of this process, will recognise this as known as parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 being the undergraduate degree in architecture, and then normally a student would go out and have a year's worth of professional experience, followed by part 2, which is a master's level qualification, again, then followed by some additional, another more experience, and then followed by part 3, professional practice exam. And that is very linear. And the important thing to understand about that, and I didn't realise before I came to carry out this piece of work, is it must be carried out in a linear process. You cannot do part 2 unless you've done part 1, and so on and so forth. So even if somebody is qualified at the part 2 level and has a higher level, they would still need that part 1, what would be regarded as a lower level of education, in order to register. And also the relevant practical experience, there are minimum time scales around that. There has to be a minimum of 2 years. So by following that logic through, there is a minimum of 7 years to be able to complete your education, no matter what your background is. In all likelihood, that's much closer to be 9 or 10 years. We were told this route is really inflexible, has a lot of repetition. It doesn't allow for innovation for institutions such as the LSA to be able to innovate and find different routes to the register. And ultimately, unless you've really come in at undergraduate level at part 1, then an undergraduate degree in architecture, then it's going to be really difficult for you to ever become an architect without having to go back to the start. So this is the proposal for a new regulatory framework. And I'm going to come back to this slide again at the end, because I think it will make more sense when I've spoken about the things that I'm going to talk about in relation to the competencies that architects need to have. But in effect, what we're saying is, rather than having the parts 1, 2, and 3, all we're going to be concerned about is the outcomes, the competencies that the student is able to demonstrate. And we've described them as 2 different stages. First of all, academic outcomes, which are competencies that a student will learn through usually through academia, but through talks. It will be taught material. And then secondly, they will have to be able to demonstrate that they can do those things. They can exercise those skills through practice. And so we call those the academic outcomes and the practice outcomes. And at its heart, this is the kernel of truth in our reform, is to say, regardless of everything else, anybody can come onto the register if they can demonstrate that they've met the academic outcomes and the practice outcomes. And if we have that as our framework, it then follows that institutions in the sector can create a number of kind of imaginative and disruptive and alternative routes that will meet students' requirements, that would still be able to get to the register, that don't necessarily fall within the usual parts 1, 2, and 3. Now I realise I'm probably already running behind time, so some of these reforms obviously will live and die on the competencies that are required, and we're going to reform those as well. And it's less relevant to this conversation today because I know we're talking about routes, but we developed a new competency framework that's currently out for consultation, and that's based on those 5 headings there of professionalism, ethics, design, research, knowledge, and management practice and leadership. And weave throughout those different competence areas are the things that you would expect, the skills in relation to building safety and building technology and sustainability. And we're going to describe those by using something called Miller's Triangle that will differentiate the level of sophistication and knowledge that's needed. So, for example, at the lower end, a student be able to demonstrate that they must know something, moving through to they know how to do it. Then they be able to demonstrate that they can show how to do it, and then finally demonstrate that they are able to do it. And it's those stages 3 and 4 that we would expect students to be able to demonstrate in practice. So the theory would go is you would learn the knowledge within the academic setting or with the academic outcomes, and then demonstrate you can do it through actual architectural practice. Very quickly, this is how the demonstration of some of the draft outcomes, how they might look. I'm not going to labour too much on those points today, but it gives you an insight of the kind of detail that we will be going into. That we'll be able to test. We'll expect institutions and learning providers to test architects on to make sure that they can do those things. So very finally, I'll rewind back to the initial slide of our new regulatory framework, because what does this mean in practice? In practice, this means that a student is likely to have to carry out a master's degree in architecture and then be able to demonstrate through a period of practical experience that they can exercise those skills that they've done, they can demonstrate the skills that they've learned through practice. This will mean that for a lot of students, they will still want to carry on and do their undergraduate degree in architecture, although we won't be accrediting it anymore. But it would also allow for students who've got a fair chance of passing at the master's level, but have done an alternative degree, whether that be in design or whether it be in a connected discipline, they wouldn't be excluded from the process. And also, it would also give the opportunity for people who've got experience within architecture that have built up those those core skills, that they could just access the educational pathway at master's level. It also then gives the opportunity for institutions to say, actually, we're going to produce a course that provides both the academic outcomes and the practice outcomes in connection with practice. So a student, for example, could have a period of learning about a certain part of architecture and then be able to demonstrate it in connection with practice as part of their course, and then return to learning again, and that would be spiral learning. I've gone over my 10 minutes by a couple of minutes, so I'm going to finish there, but I'm happy to pick up any questions after my colleagues have spoken as well.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Your timing was perfect, actually, because my intro was very short. So thank you very much for that, setting the scene. We're going to now pass over to Nick, who has been described to me as having a non-traditional route to architecture. So we're going to find out about what that actually means. So Nick, would you like to share your screen?
I don't have a presentation to show. There's only a 10-minute slot, so I'm going to talk through that journey, which is probably almost 30 years. Well, it's 30 years to get to a point of where I'm at now. I should start with the S&T as established in 81. When I joined the practice here, it was in 2011. There's 25 of us now. 2023, there's 63. We're at AJ 79th, I think, and we've got 32 qualified architects. And obviously, being on the register, you're allowed to have non-registered architects with architects, as long as it's all backed and validated and what have you. We operate in resi, retail, housing, mixed use, exhibition, and commercial offices, which is where I sit, predominantly work. Why I was attracted to working here and to follow this sort of architectural route was essentially with a meeting that I'd had with Mike Mike Stiff many years ago, and really admired their sort of agility and ability to move through interior and through into architecture and that sort of scalability. I come from a product design background, and so I'd always been a fan of the likes of Arne Jacobsen and all of those that could design things from door handles to buildings and just sort of move seamlessly through those elements. And so this sort of opportunity of a stage 2 entry level and things was never achievable or open for me. So really, I've got to sort of take you back to education and sort of unlock some of those barriers. And I think this probably covers part of the LSA's part 0, and then where we're at with part 4. We have a sort of structured system now where we're trying to get the associate teams within the office to help refresh and retrain and disseminate some of that knowledge. I grew up in Canterbury in Kent, which was suffering from a tripart system of secondary, modern, comprehensive and grammar school system. So my family are all a secondary modern. They don't have sixth form. There's no mobility. Thankfully, I managed to make it to a comprehensive, which did have a sixth form. And as a consequence of that, I had an ability to gain some kind of mobility in my education. There was no careers opportunities. I didn't even know that architecture was an option. I simply started school. Back then we did technical drawing, we did woodwork, we did metalwork. I veered away from academia as such, and was very taken by making and drawing and creativity. And so I was about the second year of GCSEs when it was all amalgamated to a CDT course. So primarily I was just following my passion of what I wanted to do. That led to A-levels. I was advised to do a foundation course, but I couldn't afford to do a foundation course. So I'd thrown an application in to do product design course at Central St Martin's, and managed to get on the course there. Having done 3 years, I achieved a BA honours in product design, but 94 when I graduated, there was a tail end of a recession. And so I racked up a huge debt, had no contacts, unemployed, got no family around. So there was no safety net. And sort of 30 years on, I'm still sort of seeing the likes of that happening now. So whilst I'd managed to access education and get some mobility, there was no impact on my social mobility. There was no way to move forward. But what I managed to do is, at the time, Prince's Youth Business Trust were around, and I basically set myself up in business, designing, producing furniture to get into shops, retail, and that led me on to then an appetite to get into bigger, more adventurous things, and started in exhibitions and retail. And I'd met Peter Murray, which was very fortuitous at the time, and he introduced me to Mike Stiff. And so in the late 90s, I worked with Stiff Trevillion on 2 exhibitions at the Royal Academy of Art on the Tadeo Ando retrospective and Chinese ceramics. I then later went on to do similar sort of work with Piers Goff, and even managed to do a kitchen with Paul Monaghan at HM. So I was doing a lot of on-the-job training to try to explore and develop this sort of spatial nature and heading towards an architectural arena and working with architects. But I didn't really know I wanted to be specifically there. So I plateaued, and I'd married, got a young family, and what to do next. So I needed to, I think, formalize that. And so what I did is I wound my business down and joined a very, very small architectural practice where I felt that the work that I'd been doing and that I was advancing through would give them assistance. And meanwhile, took on board more technical detailing and architectural issues, and sort of learned from that. And after about 5 years, there was no growth there. I knew that I wanted to actively seek sort of bigger, more adventurous work. And this is where this entry level into part 2 could take place. And for me, it wasn't an option, but I'd had this postcard on my desk for what must have been 10 years or more, from Stiff Trevillion. And so I looked them up, researched them again, looked across various other different companies and things. I thought, no, I've got to give them a call because I want to move on. And I'd gotten on really well with Mike, loved the work that was going through the practice, had a chat with him, showed him a portfolio, and they took the investment and offered me a job and have supported me through that for a number of years now. So it's not without, it's only through their backing and support and their sort of vision on that, and being able to move through the various jobs that I've been able to get to the position that I am now at, and hopefully start disseminating some of that information that I've gathered over the years back into the office and help some of those people that are moving through, whether it's part 1, 2, alternative routes and things. So, it's been a long haul, but every day I'm learning things and still learning. So I'm very intrigued to see the sort of reforms and things and what comes out of the responses to this.
Thanks very much, Nick. We're running a little ahead of time, but I think I'm inclined to press on and listen to hear from Chloe, because I think there are lots of things that I'm very sure there'll be a lot of questions and a discussion to be had, rather than trying to kind of pick up questions now. But an amazing story and an inspiring one, so thank you. Chloe, do you want to are you going to do a presentation? Are you going to share your screen, or?
Yes, I am going to share my screen.
Okay, well, would you like to do that and tell us about your version of the world?
Yeah, for sure. Let me get it. Yeah, thanks. So yes, my name's Chloe, and I'm talking about my alternative route into architecture, which was becoming the first Build the Way intern at GPAD. But before I talk about that, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to my route into architecture. So it was a big interest of mine since a very young age. And I started to develop my interest in architecture during secondary school. So that's when I was realizing that I actually wanted to go with this career path. So during that time, I was just making plans and finding out different ways I could try and immerse myself in architecture. And that's where my journey started. And the challenges I faced during my journey. So after secondary school, I ended up finding a sixth form college that actually had architecture as an A-level course. So I went to that sixth form. But afterwards, I knew that I didn't want to go straight to uni. I wanted to find a practical route into architecture. But my biggest challenge was having no network. So what I had to do was actually push myself to find the right group of people that could actually help me get that work experience that I was looking for. Another challenge that I had was not knowing where to start or how to reach out to people in the industry. So what I would do is find different events and spaces that I could attend to make sure that I was immersing myself within the architecture industry in some way, just so I can actually get my name out there and people actually notice that I'm actually trying to get the work experience that I'm looking for. So through networking, so a big architectural group that did help me out with that was the Black Females in Architecture. They helped me figure out what it is that I'm trying to look for and the best route I could take to get through that. So through networking, I was made aware of the Build the Way internship, which I ended up applying for. And that was run through the Port Collective and GPAD. And after receiving the news of my application being successful, I felt like I'd taken a big step in my journey because I was finally getting a chance to experience working in the architecture practice, something that I've been looking forward to. And I think it took me 3 years to actually get this experience. So it was a very long time in my eyes. But I was also unaware of the number of doors and opportunities that would arise from the internship alone. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but it was definitely something big and grand. And here's a video of me explaining a bit more about the internship.
I'm just wondering, it's not running, is it? I'm just wondering if
it's enough time.
That's
it
right.
shouldn't be too long.
Here we go. It's loading. There you go. Patience with the technology.
I applied for the Build the Way internship because I've always wanted to experience how it was working inside an architecture practice, because I'm more of a practical learner. So me being in the field would be beneficial to what I'm trying to achieve. Yes, I'll recommend this internship to people that have a similar interest in me, that like to learn on the job, because you actually do get to gain as much experience as you can figuring out what it is that you want to do and whether you want to carry on in a role in architecture. The most rewarding part of the internship is knowing that you have a wide range of connections and also gaining a whole heap of experience, because one of my main struggles was like when trying to find anything to do with like an internship or an apprenticeship was having the connections and people having the belief that I can actually attain the goals that I've set.
I always thought that the typical three-part education route was convoluted and didn't really offer opportunities for everybody. I think it provides a big barrier for entry into the industry, financially and time-wise, being a 7-year course. I think through discussions with Paul Collective, we decided that we wanted to make some kind of change, whatever small or large, and I think the internship was our way of providing someone an opportunity to get into the industry who wouldn't ordinarily have an opportunity to. I think the Build the Way internship is our opportunity to provide a small change to the industry and make sure that we're providing opportunities for people who wouldn't ordinarily go to university. I think over the coming years we'd like to grow our network of people who also think the same as us and provide more opportunities. So rather than one intern, maybe we could provide 2 or 3 opportunities for people, and alongside this provide ways to support those people through smaller courses or talks or networks, and hopefully these people can play a positive role in the built environment in the future.
Just going back to my PowerPoint. It's frozen at the moment, but I just won't use it. I'll just go back to old school. Yeah, I'm just taking off the PowerPoint now, I'll just speak. But yeah, that was just a video further explaining my reasonings that why I wanted to get into a work experience. And it was very beneficial for me. At the time when recording the video, I was very shy and I didn't really want to be on camera, but I've actually improved my talking skills. And that was a big help with the support that I was getting at GPAD, because they always knew that in order for me to be successful, I needed to improve those type of skills to get to the point that I'm at now. And that was very beneficial. And with that, I've been able to gain even more opportunities. So I was able to also write articles about my experience being an internship and finding ways into architecture, like not through the traditional route. So I was very grateful for being an intern at GPAD and all the opportunities that it's given me up until this point. And yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chloe. Yeah, another really inspiring presentation. Thanks to everybody. We've now got a really comfortable half an hour to have quite a discussion and questions. I think there are now, having set the landscape for we are poised for change. All being well, that the world out there in the world of architecture and the built environment is receptive to those ideas, and that I guess we will know after Simon has done his summer homework in analysing the responses to the ARB's proposals, and having now heard about two, I guess, not what would be classified as non-traditional routes to architecture. There are a couple of things that really just jumped out to me was this word network, uncanny that we are here with the practice network, and that's was a central part of the way that the LSA was conceived, to try to make and extend connections from academia through to practice, and use that as essentially, or develop that as a kind of form of extended faculty, rather than a separation between the two. Although we still find ourselves talking about practice and academia a lot. And I find myself as an academic director talking a lot about, what is gained in practice and what is gained in academia. And I prefer to see it as one form of learning. It's just that some skills lean one way and some skills lean towards another. So I'm still question how useful it is that we keep reinforcing those separations. But this word network seemed to be absolutely fundamental to both Nick and Chloe's stories in slightly different ways, but ultimately network being about people and the people that you encounter and the people that you are either lucky enough to meet. Serendipity puts you in the right place at the right time, and in a way, and certainly in both cases, you made that happen because of Nick, you really wanting to develop your interests and just getting out there and doing it. So you created that network, and you, Chloe, just having this innate interest and thinking someone somewhere is out there who can help me do this. And I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about that. For me, it feels still in a way a very traditional form, that network, it's the people you know or the people you're lucky enough to suddenly find that can help you on your way. And whether there's something that on a more structural level, i.e. in education, further earlier on in your forms of education, that could help support that. Because I've experienced both schools, locally in London, state schools, through to the most well-resourced private schools that have absolutely no knowledge of architecture, or really what is even required to get into that subject, or what that subject actually might even be.
Yeah.
So I just wonder whether maybe Nick or Chloe, you could say a little bit more about that.
For myself, there was no network when I was passing through. Now, at S&T, we actually do go into schools, and we have a schools program. One of the associates here takes a team in, spends a day with the school, gets them really excited, and through a project, so they get to learn about architecture from a very early age, and sets a sort of base and awareness for that. And I think it is just about, I guess, industry investing in education and kind of closing that gap that we need to do, keep that conversation going, because if it's on their radar from an early age, and then now we're looking at an outcomes based appraisal. I mean, my network was effectively a result of outcomes. I was working and that was in front of other people, where they picked it up and said, okay, I can see you can do that. Could you do this? And then the next one and the next one and the next one. There wasn't a sort of a show opening of something and then you're swept off your feet and move forward. It's just very iterative. And it's very much about outcomes based. You're only as good really as what you produce. And we need to be effective in that. And then hopefully that just to widen your network, and people start to understand, because people generally do want to work with people that they align with, and that can deliver what they're after, and share the same vision.
Yeah, I also agree with what Nick says. Like, your network definitely helps you get to the goals that you do want to achieve, because even when at times I thought it wasn't going to be possible, there was always someone there that I had spoken to earlier saying, look, you've gotten all of this done, so why don't you think it's possible? So when you do put yourself in those spaces, you're actually motivated and determined to do more. So network is definitely a big thing, and it does help you get to where you want to be.
There are more and more alumni. It seems quite normal now to have that, and I think, you know, if we can encourage more and more people to get back in touch, and you know, through that process as well, because the more contact that you've got, it closes that education and industry gap.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, it's so, and I mean, I wonder whether there was, Chloe, particularly, whether there was someone that because I'm interested, you knew so early on that you were interested in architecture, or this word architecture, and where that came from. What was it, your experience of architecture, just being in the world? Was there a person that what was that sort of what sparked that initial interest?
I would say, like, when I was younger and just experiencing the spaces that I would go to. So I grew up in a council estate, so being around there and seeing all the flats, like, everything just wasn't getting taken care of. But for me, it was like, that was my home and that was something special to me. So what I thought is that, like, why can't I be able to design a space that's dear to my heart and make it special for everyone else around me? So it's kind of something that's always, like, been on my mind, but I didn't realize it was architecture until I got older. And then when I realized it was architecture, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm interested in that. Let me just carry on and see what it is that I can offer in architecture. And just, like, making sure that I was following the routes to stay within the goal that I'm trying to reach. Yeah.
Very, very logical approach, and a very rational approach.
Yeah.
Amazing. The rational, fantastic. The other two bits that I was interested in, then I will open up for questions because I can see time ticking on. There was one part which is and I think, Nick, you touched on it, was about scalability, and scalability of learning. And I think this touches on some of the ARB proposal as well, and certainly how we think, how architectural education in a way is conceived, that you sort of start with an awareness, and then you start to build, you know, real sort of demonstrable skill, and beyond just awareness, real deep knowledge of a subject. And that is a kind of both scalable process. You can often start with something quite small or relatively modest, but then by degrees of complexity, you start to build in, which seems to me a very reasonable way to approach what is a fantastically complex and layered subject, particularly architecture, or the role of the architect being one that is so expansive, and that can be reasonably scalable, but what we're looking at potentially with the ARB proposals is that can be also quite labyrinthine. I mean, you can do that in a lot of different ways. At the moment, there's a sort of structure from part 1 to part 2 to part 3, and there's a scalable form of, you know, moving through that education. But the minute we start to open it up, which is a very exciting prospect, is how do you can you see that is a sort of equally scalable process of learning? Or maybe it isn't, and it's moving. So to both of you, both Chloe and Nick, and then I think I will come to Simon, when you entered that world, and I think, Nick, you described it really, really well, is that you followed the process of the outcomes. You did something and then something developed from there. Can you see the world of learning about architecture, and maybe wider the built environment or working within a field, as something that can cope, given that it is so complex, that it can cope with all of that labyrinthine and potentially even wider possible routes? So it's a very long...
It's a very complicated question, really.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, I've got two children, one in lower sixth, one in university. So I've been right the way through their education. And what I'm sort of observing, or what I think is feels as if they're being taught to pass an exam as opposed to learn for learning. And what we have in architecture, and what's fantastic, is that every day you can learn more and more and more and more. So it's invaluable to keep that process of learning and learn to learn. and you know, that's the thing that I really try to encourage with education from a very early stage, and that makes it scalable, because if you know where your reach is, you know that you're not punching above your weight. You've got the ability to move into an arena, get comfortable, and then move on again, and then every day you learn. So the projects for me since very early have just gotten sort of bigger, more complex, into planning and more legislative areas of management, and those decisions become bigger and more important and more responsible. But you can still always right the way down to a tiny little detail, which improves your environment. So it's a great arena to be in, but it is a complex issue.
Well, I think it makes for a real case for a kind of non-linear learning. And what does it mean? As you point out, in conventional education, it is extremely linear, and the value in being able to think in a very non-linear way, and how to develop that is an extraordinary set of skills. I'm going to jump to Simon and ask you that question before opening up to our audience. Has that sort of played a role in developing this rethink? Is there touching on that ways of learning?
Yes, it has. So going back to one of your earlier points about, there's almost infinite options and infinite flexibility. And of course, as a regulator, that's a real headache, because the promised land isn't one where there is an infinite number of routes to the register, because ultimately our number one priority is to be able to assure the public that everybody on the register, everybody has met those minimum standards, and there has to be some limitations around that. There's a limitation to us having the confidence to say we can accredit this route. And our entire approach is based on one qualifications, because that's what the law says that we accredit. So there are limitations to it. I think the really key aspect for us is, and you've touched on it, and Sam and Nick's touched on it as well, is being an architect is incredibly complex, and there's an awful lot there in terms of breadth and also in depth. What is the appropriate point that we say? And it's almost a false point of saying at this point you're entitled to be a registered architect, and that there's a range of options of where that bar could be. And I think that's one of the really key questions that we're trying to explore as part of this consultation of, when is it okay to say, I know enough now to be registered, I know enough to be an architect, I'm safe, I can treat my clients well. And it's those very important fundamentals of being an architect. We say, okay, you're okay to be registered here, but that's not to say that the journey stops. And it's really important to recognise that. And I know you're doing a lot of work with Part 4, and the RIBA is introducing a new competence framework around principal design, and we wouldn't expect a day one architect to be able to be a principal designer on a complex project. But it's that key point of where on the journey do we say, yes, that's okay to be registered. I think that's a really important question that we're asking.
Yeah. No. Great. Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to open up to questions in the room, or the room that we are in, which is out there. I don't see any in the chat, and I'm going to ask John to let me know if we have any questions in the room. I'd be amazed if we don't, and perhaps let me know if we do. Any news from the chat room, John? No. Maybe I'll ask.
Oh, I have a question. Sorry, Sam. It's Marsha
yes.
here.
Oh, hi, Marsha. Hi, Marsha.
Yeah,
yes, go ahead.
I put a couple of questions in the chat, actually, so I'm not quite sure where it's gone. It's disappeared into the ether somewhere.
Thanks for letting us know.
I've got a couple of questions. First was a comment, and then I've got a question for Chloe, and then a question for Simon. So if you don't know, I work in inclusion in architecture and the built environment, and trying to shape inclusive behaviours in the sector. And my first comment was that it's Denzel Washington who says there's no such thing as luck. It's about being prepared for your opportunities. And it's really great to hear both Nick and Chloe not only preparing for their opportunities, but creating those opportunities for themselves. And I think there's something about that drive and ambition which really shapes excellence in architecture. My question for Chloe was, what are you actually doing now? So you've gone through your internship. Are you studying in the traditional route right now?
Yes, so basically I've gone through the internship, and in September I'll be going back to uni. But originally the plan was to get an apprenticeship, but due to a couple of things that happened, I kind of had to reroute and actually go back to the traditional route and go to uni to get my Part 1 degree.
But clearly you would have preferred to stay in the sort of more apprenticeship opportunity if that had been presented to you?
Yes. So
right.
What had happened was I did apply. I went through all the necessary steps to get the apprenticeship, but it wasn't a fault on my part. It was more so the uni not being able to host me at the time. So in the long term, it made more sense for me to go back to uni and get the degree, because it would have been shorter than actually doing the apprenticeship at the moment.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank you
for sharing your update. Simon, for you, I was just looking at what you're hoping those going through the non-traditional route are looking to demonstrate. And there's quite a lot there, obviously, around inclusion, EDI. And my concern is, how do we help those students to demonstrate those things when indeed practice themselves aren't always supportive of demonstrating some of those EDI criteria that you're hoping the students will?
Hi, Marsha. That's quite a big question to unpick. Are you talking about access to practices and practices conduct when they have students having work experience with them, or are you talking more generally about architectural practices providing an example to the future generations?
I think it's a bit of both, to be fair, Simon, because I think one feeds into the other, really.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the Gordian knot that we haven't cut here is access to good quality practice. And we know that there are two real issues in relation to that. First of all is access. And the secondly is, there's no shying away from it, that some of the stories we've heard and the evidence we've heard as part of our research and engagement has spread a pretty dark light on the conduct of some employers in relation to their students, bearing in mind the disbalance of power between the two. Now, there are a number of ways of going about that. We need to strengthen our code of conduct, and the RIBA need to strengthen their code of practice in relation to how employers deal with their students. But there's also a fundamental, I think, need for greater clarity about what an employer's responsibility is towards its students and what the consequences are of not meeting with those responsibilities, not just in terms of their conduct towards them in terms of discrimination and mistreatment, but in terms of the quality of practice, the resource they get, the breadth of practice they get. And that's something we need to tackle. I think we've tried to be clear by saying this is such a big issue that we can't deal with it at the same time as we can with opening up routes and dealing with new competencies. Because if we try and eat the whole elephant at once, we're not going to get anywhere. But it's certainly, as soon as this consultation closes, we issue these are the new standards for providers. These are the new competencies architects need to have. This is the world as we see it in relation to being able to access to the register. Then we really need to turn our attention to how can we improve students' ability and students' access to good quality experience where they're being treated properly.
Thanks, Simon. And of course, my book will be coming out next year, which determines best practice around practical guide to EDI in architecture and the built environment, which hopefully will help practices with their best practice in this area.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Marsha. And yes, you are very welcome to promote your good work on the Thursday Talk show, as it were. Thanks very much, and touched on very relevant points. Are there any other questions in the room? And I think it's probably likely that you're best to either raise your hand or do as Marsha did and say, yes, I've got a question, because it doesn't seem to be anything in the chat at the moment. Anybody out there? No. A quiet lot today. Oh, yes, Jalal. Jalal,
Hello,
yes.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. I posted it in the chat. I think people might be typing them, but if it's not coming through, I'm not sure why. But I asked, are there any potential revisions to the part 3 portion that currently exists, or the latter part, if you want to be more broad, that current studying part 2s may experience? Does anybody have any thoughts on that, or are there any information?
Yeah, I can tackle that. So to transition from one system to the other is always complex, because probably students that are currently studying part 2 won't really be affected by our proposals, because it will take time for them to run through. But future part 2 students, there will be a period of transition, because the proposal is that some of the taught material that's currently taught in part 3 will move into the master's course. So the new part 3, as you might want to call it, is just going to be demonstrating through practice what you've learned, rather than having new taught material. But that won't impact, as I say, for a few years yet. Probably not until 2027. Students coming out of part 2 going into part 3 we'll need to be worried about them. But that's our worry, to get them through that, rather than put that on the students.
Fair enough, thank you.
Thanks, Jalal. Again, as I can't seem to sound, I apologise, everybody, because I'm not seeing the chat. But if you are typing in a question, or you have one that you're willing to, yes, Nancy is prepared to speak hers. That would be great. Hi, Nancy.
Hiya. I'm also with Stiff Trevillion. I'm in the same office as Nick at the moment. But I was just curious, Simon, you mentioned about the potential of other routes in, and in terms of looking at other master's options that could potentially lead you to an equivalent of the part 2, but coming from, do you mean not necessarily architectural routes, like not necessarily masters in architecture specifically, but in other fields that relate to?
No, so it would still have to be a master's in architecture, because that's a very tight set of, this is what you need to know. But certainly the equivalent of part 1 now, undergraduate in architecture, most students would still do that. But what we're saying is, as long as you've got a fair chance of being able to pass the masters in architecture. So for example, if you've gone off and done an undergraduate in, I don't know, history, with no background in design at all, you're not really going to be able to have a fair chance of passing the competencies required, because you're going to be quite testing at master's level. However, if you've got a lot of experience and you've done, I don't know, architectural technology or some of the connected topic, we're saying you shouldn't be prevented from accessing the masters for that reason.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And I guess what it also means is that there's the potential to bring in a range of other ways of learning, not necessarily an undergraduate degree, but certainly apprenticeship credits, or a whole other stream of credit systems that could be valued and then built up.
Absolutely. I think we're going to have to work with providers to give them some help as to who they should be allowing to access the master's course or not, as much help as providers think they want, because we don't want to set anyone up to fail. But similarly, there's a balance there between not doing that and opening it up to people who haven't perhaps got a traditional background in architecture, but got the right skills and background to give them a fighting chance of being able to complete the masters and get the right experience.
Thanks very much. Any other questions out there? Hands up if you do. That seems to be the bit that's working well. I can see hands go up. Jalal's still got his hand up, so I'm just checking that you haven't got another question.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm good.
No, okay. No other, yes. Java, is that Java there?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So I I had a question for Nick. When you were mentioning like going into schools and engaging young people within architecture, and more generally this issue of young people not really being aware of getting into the industry and the profession. I just wanted to ask what you think the best way to engage young people about architecture is, or what do you think is really important for them to know or to emphasize, or just what your general approach to it is?
Well, I think the general approach is to gain an interest in design generally, and then that can be explored through a day's workshop in terms of generating. A great thing at that sort of age is model making and understanding form and generating that, and then what the outcomes of that have, and discussing all of those things. So in the fact that I didn't do a foundation simply because I knew I wouldn't have the ability to afford to do a foundation and then go on to where that foundation course may have opened me up at that point to say you should study architecture, but without that I didn't have that opportunity. So I think you've got to present at that age quite an open palette of things for them to access, and that could be more graphic orientated. It could be, product and things. So it's possibly just needs more kind of structure. You don't necessarily go in and expect them to be able to attempt to design a building per se. So the projects and the natures of what you do need to be more open and explorative, because it's about learning. It's about getting into that space of learning about spatial quality, form, and
yeah. Thank you. That was very insightful.
Thank you, Nick. And I think you've reiterated it a number of times that this is about learning. It's about also about asking questions. I mean, I think if that's one thing we've learned from, or I hope we're beginning to learn from recent, and it's usually dire circumstances that bring these things to our attention repeatedly. I guess Grenfell is always on my mind as one, that it is the importance of learning to ask questions and not being afraid to ask questions. That seems to me to be at the heart of what we do as architects and designers. That's how that kind of process evolves, and hopefully, and should be by now, improving. So I'm conscious that we are now 2 minutes to closure. So I'm going to wrap up. I really want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a really, really nice range of just starting to sort of open up what I think is clearly another kind of stage in, it hasn't happened, I guess, for at least 150 years, kind of such a radical change in redescribing the territory of learning to be architects and learning about how to be an architect and architecture itself. And so I'm glad to be alive to be a part of that conversation, and to see students and younger people like you, Chloe, just finding a way through and actually asking that fundamental question: how can I do this better at whatever age you were, which sounds like it was probably quite young. And that is just the critical bit, if without asking that question, these things will not change. And to you, Nick, for describing such a resourceful and ambitious, but very described in such humble terms, way of just finding a way through to do what you really wanted to do, which is fantastic, and making it happen by doing that. And to you, Simon, for in lots of ways unenviable work to try to stir up huge change, which I hope goes well for you as a process. Certainly here at the LSA, I know it's been referred to a couple of times, part 0 and part 4, our attempts as a school to really embrace that change. And as I said, feel very, very proud and pleased to be a part of it, and keen to watch it evolve. So it is 2:00, and thank you so much. Want to congratulate you all on achievements, and hope to see you again soon in this room. And thank you all to out there for joining us. See you again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much.